In this video, we're going to see how you can manually adjust the aperture with your Canon DSLR. Now, a brief review of what an aperture is, if you don't know. The aperture is the opening inside of your lens. So inside each of your lenses, you actually have a hole that opens up. Generally, every lens can open up or close down. When it's wide open, more light passes through. When it's closed down, less light passes through. So if you want to use your aperture to make your image brighter, what do you think you have to do? You have to make the hole bigger to let more light in. So again, it's just one of the other options we have in our camera to manually expose properly. So let's look at our camera, let's look at the info. So we're not in the live preview mode, but if we're looking at this screwdriver over here again, we see this f5.6. That is our aperture. All apertures are represented as f-stops, and depending on your lens, you have a scale or a range of f-stops that your aperture can go open up to or close down to. More expensive lenses can actually open up even wider and let in even more light than a cheaper lens like the one I have on here, which is just a little 24mm pancake lens, called pancake lens because it's very flat. So first, how do we adjust our aperture? There's a couple ways to do it. The quickest way is to press this AV button right here, and then while we're doing that, actually adjust the same dial that we use to adjust the shutter speed. So here I can go through this and you can see going down to f2.8, all the way up the f-stop scale up to f22. Now the confusing thing about f-stops is how the numbers correlate with the actual size of the hole. So if we go down to f2.8, this is actually where the hole is largest and lets in the most amount of light. If we go up to f22, that's where the hole is actually the smallest and lets in the least amount of light. Another way to adjust this with this camera is with the touch screen. So on the Canon T7i and some other DSLRs, you can press the Q button and then just press on the option you want to change, or use the plus pad over here, press set to go into it, and then you can scroll, or just use the plus pad to adjust that setting. Or you can literally just go around, press the button, and then use the dial to adjust it. As you can see though, that's a few extra steps than just simply holding down the AV button and then scrolling with the dial. So I think that's the best way to do it. Some DSLRs will actually have multiple dials, so not only the shutter speed dial, which is up here, but a dial on the back of the grip there that can adjust the aperture as well. All right, so now let's go into our live view mode so we can see what this is actually doing. So remember what I talked about in the last lesson about how if your shutter speed is too slow, you can get a little camera shake and your photos end up being blurry? As a general rule of thumb, I would recommend if you are shooting handheld that you don't go below 1/60th of a second or even 1/80th. Now notice though in this view, in the live view, that we don't see the fraction that we saw on the back of the menu if we're not in live view. See how it says 1/80th? But if we're in the live view mode, it just shows 80. That might be how you see it on the back of your camera as well. You won't see the fraction. So just know though that that's the shutter speed and it's actually a fraction of that 1/80th. Knowing that our shutter speed, if we're shooting handheld, should be 1/80th or faster, see how dark it is? It's too dark. Luckily, we have those other settings, the ISO and the aperture, to manually expose properly. So let's go into our aperture. Here we can just click the button down there and scroll up or down to a more wide open aperture. Now, depending on your camera though, you're not going to be able to see the little preview of your exposure down here on the meter when you are adjusting the aperture. So you kind of have to just eyeball it. And then if you go back into your preview, press the shutter speed halfway down, then you'll see if it's exposed properly. But just by eyeballing it with the T7i, I can see that I want to be at like an f2.8. Now I go back and I see that it's just over our middle mark on our exposure meter. Now if I want to get it right on the middle, we might just go to our AV mode and drop it down to f3.2 right there. So if I take this photo, it looks like it's perfectly exposed right in the middle of our meter. One other thing I wanted to mention is it might be easier to see this and adjust these settings when you're not in the live view, but when you're using the actual viewfinder. So if you half press the shutter when you're looking through the viewfinder, you'll probably notice the exposure meter plus your settings. So right now, on the back of my camera, I'm at 1/100th of a second, f2.8 and ISO 200. Looking through this on the bottom, I can see those numbers. And here I can see the exposure meter actually going through whether I adjust the shutter speed or if I adjust the aperture. Now I'm pressing the AV button and adjusting the dial here. And here within the viewfinder, I can actually see the preview of what that looks like. So what's great about Canon cameras is that you can really see that exposure meter both in the live preview mode or on the back of the screen, or if you're looking through the viewfinder. So that's how you adjust your aperture manually and also how that affects exposure. Hopefully this makes sense. Again, if this is confusing to you, the whole photography masterclass is there for you to understand these settings even further. And that class paired with this one, hopefully now you understand how to use your Canon camera to adjust those settings. All right, in the next lesson, we're gonna be looking at ISO. The last setting that helps us manually expose is our ISO. Think of the ISO as the sensitivity of your sensor. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is, meaning the brighter your image is going to be. The lower your ISO, the less sensitive and the darker it's going to be. So we have the ISO button right here. If we click that once, we have our ISO menu. We already saw this. We went from auto to 200, but we can also go higher. So this is kind of the last option that I like to use to adjust exposure manually. I generally like to have it the lowest possible, so ISO 100 in any sort of situation. But depending on your lens, depending on the lighting, depending on your shutter speed and aperture options, you might have to increase the ISO just to expose properly. So here let's just go as an example, we change our shutter speed to 1/80th of a second. We also changed our f-stop to f2.8. It's still a little bit underexposed, just to the left of the 0. Now that's probably fine. It's going to look fine. But if we wanted it to be a little bit brighter, the last option we have is the ISO. So that's where we can press the ISO button, we can press the Q button, we can go there and we can adjust here. And that's the ISO speed. Let's go up to 200 and now we can see that we're a little bit overexposed or above the 0. And maybe that's the style you want with this photo. Now let's go through one more time and see what if we adjust it even higher. Let's go up to 3200. Now we are way overexposed. So if I take an image, way too bright. So that's obviously not what we want to do. But I just want to show you now, if we go back to 100, take a picture, that is definitely exposed even better. So that's how you adjust your ISO and what it does when you adjust it. But why do we want it to be as low as possible? In general, with most cameras, if you increase the ISO, you start to get a little bit of digital noise or digital grain in your image. You'll see that if you go out and take a picture somewhere where it's a little bit dark and you increase your ISO up past 1600 or 3200 with most basic DSLRs like the Canon T7i. And that's because it's really just digitally enhancing the image to make it brighter. Unlike the shutter speed or the aperture, which is a physical way to let more or less light in, the ISO is just a digital way of doing it. And if you're somewhere where it's pitch black, really dark outside, if it's at night and you're just shooting with the light of the moon or the stars, there really isn't going to be a lot of options for making your image brighter with the shutter speed or aperture. And so the ISO might be the only option, but depending on your camera, you can only go so far. Yes, the ISO on this camera can go up past 1600 or 3200, but would I want to use that ISO? Probably not, because with a lot of basic DSLRs, it just doesn't look that good. With more advanced DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, you actually can shoot at a very high ISO and you still get a clean image without a lot of digital noise or grain. But you'll just have to do some tests with your own camera to see how far you can push your ISO before it gets too grainy. Now, we talked about the ways you can adjust the exposure internally in your camera, but there's a major other factor that determines how bright your image is, and that's how much light there is in your scene. So of course, we can do things in our scene to add more light, like using a flash, turning on more lights, opening a window, and things like that, which is the other way to adjust your exposure. In the next lesson, I briefly want to talk about putting all of these settings together and the exposure triangle.